Every civilization that once controlled global finance believed they were the exception. They all convinced themselves their currency would outlive history, that their influence was permanent, that their system had transcended the fate of every empire before them. But the record is brutal and unbroken. The Portuguese Real survived for roughly 80 years. The Dutch guilder held the crown for about the same length of time. The British pound endured just over a century, and each one crumbled through the exact same 7-stage sequence. Not one escaped the pattern. Not one cheated the mathematics. The US dollar took command in 1944. That was 81 years ago. And in 2025, it sits squarely in stage 5 of the same blueprint that crushed every world reserve before it. This isn't fear-mongering or prophecy. The numbers don't care about belief. They don't care about patriotism. They only care about structural forces, deficits, trade balances, debt accumulation, and the erosion of confidence. When you zoom out, the pattern becomes so obvious it's almost uncomfortable to acknowledge. 4 full cycles across 600 years, each following the same arc. The real question is whether we can recognize we're standing inside the same storyline, or whether we fall into the delusion that this time is different, the most dangerous sentence in economic history. Before we walk through the 7 stages, you need one thing absolutely clear. A reserve currency is not simply the strongest currency. It's the currency other nations hoard in their central banks. The currency used to price oil, metals, wheat, and almost every global commodity. The unit of account that international trade settles in. When your currency becomes the reserve, the world needs it for practically everything. If a country wants Middle Eastern oil, it needs the currency used to price oil. If it wants to balance trade accounts, it needs the accepted universal medium of exchange. If it wants safe assets, it buys the government bonds denominated in that currency. This creates what the French once called exorbitant privilege, and there's no exaggeration in that label. The reserve currency nation can print money and export it in exchange for real, tangible goods. Everyone else has to sweat for those same units. Every other nation must produce, must extract, must manufacture in order to earn what the reserve currency nation can simply create. You can run deficits with no immediate consequence because the world must accumulate your currency. You can borrow cheaper than everyone else because global demand for your bonds isn't optional. It's structural. To quote economist Jacques Rueff, who watched these cycles unfold firsthand, the deficit country becomes the banker to the world. And bankers get to set the rules. This is why empires fight so viciously to gain reserve status, and why their decline begins the moment they lose it. Because once the privilege disappears, the illusion collapses, and the true cost of living above your productive capacity is revealed. The rise always starts the same way. Stage 1, overwhelming military dominance over critical trade routes. It's not enough to have a strong navy or sophisticated weapons. The empire must control the arteries of global commerce. In the mid-1400s, Portugal achieved something that was almost sci-fi for its time. They mastered long-distance ocean navigation, while every other European power hugged coastlines like nervous swimmers. Portuguese sailors dove into open waters. When they rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488, they cracked the code to Asia and bypassed the Ottoman-controlled land routes entirely. And they weaponized this discovery. The Indian Ocean, the South China Sea, East Africa, Portuguese warships patrolled them like toll collectors with cannons. Their trading posts weren't storefronts. They were militarized checkpoints. Goa, Malacca, Macau, Mozambique, fortified nodes where the Portuguese decided who could trade and at what price. If you wanted spices from the Moluccas, you played by Portuguese rules. If you tried to bypass their system, they seized your ship. The real became the currency of global trade, not because it was elegant or backed by superior economics, but because Portugal controlled the world's most profitable choke points. The Dutch replicated the model a century later. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC, wasn't a corporation in the modern sense. It was a hybrid of Wall Street and a private military. 40 warships, 20,000 soldiers, legal authority to wage war and sign treaties. They seized Portuguese outposts, dominated the Baltic and Indian Ocean routes, and transformed Amsterdam into the gravitational center of world trade. If you wanted access to the richest markets on Earth, you needed Dutch guilders. Britain perfected the system. The Royal Navy in the 1800s was so dominant that Britannia rules the waves wasn't a metaphor. It was a blunt, measurable fact. They controlled Gibraltar, Singapore, the Suez Canal, the Strait of Malacca. Every strategic corridor that mattered ran through the British Empire's defensive perimeter. And the pound sterling became the world's accounting language because British cannons enforced it. The United States continued the lineage after 1945. 11 carrier strike groups, military bases near every single major trade choke point. Hormuz, Suez, Malacca, Panama, Bab el-Mandeb. Whether people admit it or not, the backbone of the dollar's supremacy is American control of global commerce routes. That military dominance leads directly into stage 2, massive trade surpluses and the accumulation of global wealth. Every empire follows the same path. First you dominate the routes, then you dominate the flow of goods, then you dominate the profits. Portugal's ships returned to Lisbon loaded with spices and silks that sold for 10 times their purchase price. The Dutch captured global arbitrage. Britain industrialized and exported machinery and textiles to the entire world. And after World War II, the United States produced everything the planet needed. Cars, steel, appliances, machines. Dollars flooded foreign banks faster than they could be recycled. And then comes stage 3, the official coronation. The world formally declares your currency the global reserve. Treaties are written in your unit of account. Contracts adopt your standard. Bretton Woods did for the dollar what the Congress of Vienna did for the pound. This is the peak. But as economist Robert Triffin warned in 1960, this peak contains the poison that eventually kills the system. The world needs your currency so badly that you must run deficits to supply it. The surplus becomes a deficit. The producer becomes a consumer. And once that flip happens, the decline begins. And that shift, when nations move from creating wealth to consuming it, is exactly where stage 4 starts. Stage 4 is the moment every reserve currency begins drifting away from its own foundation. It's the transition from producing wealth to consuming it, from selling value to buying comfort, from building the world's engine to living off what was built in previous generations. And the most dangerous part is that it never feels like decline when it starts. It feels like prosperity. It feels like strength. It feels like the good life finally arriving. Portugal entered this stage in the mid-1500s. The trade surpluses that once made Lisbon a glittering capital dried up. Instead of exporting goods, Portugal began importing almost everything. Grain from Sicily, fabrics from Northern Europe, finished goods from across the continent. What paid for this new dependence wasn't fresh production. It was the giant inflow of Brazilian gold and silver. As long as galleons kept unloading bullion at European ports, the crown didn't feel the shift. The royal court spent lavishly. Palaces, festivals, military parades. Money poured out faster than new value came in. But because the gold ships kept arriving, nobody felt the urgency to course correct. Historian Fernand Braudel once wrote that nations mistake the glow of accumulated wealth for the heat of fresh creation. Portugal embodied that idea. They weren't getting rich, they were liquidating the past. The Dutch followed the same script in the 1700s. Amsterdam's unbelievable wealth made its citizens comfortable. Too comfortable. Why grind in shipyards or textile mills when decades of trade surpluses allowed you to live off investment income? Dutch capital flowed into bonds, mortgages, and lending across Europe. These activities were profitable, but they weren't productive. They didn't expand domestic capacity. They didn't generate new trade dominance. Meanwhile, Dutch industry atrophied. Britain and France began outperforming the same Dutch sectors that once dominated the world. The trade balance flipped from surplus to deficit, and to pay for the shortfall, the Dutch liquidated the very capital that had made them a powerhouse. Britain's decline was even clearer. By the early 1900s, the nation that had launched the Industrial Revolution was importing more manufactured goods than it exported. British households were eating food grown abroad, wearing cotton processed elsewhere, and using goods produced in Germany and the United States. London financed half the world, but British factories were falling behind. The empire was living on dividends from its foreign investments: railways in India, mines in Africa, plantations in the Caribbean. These returns were enormous, but again, they were passive. They weren't building new competitive industries at home. Britain was extracting the past instead of creating the future. Stage 4 in its purest form. America entered Stage 4 in 1971. That was the year the trade surplus flipped permanently into a deficit. The US began importing more than it exported: electronics, vehicles, machinery, textiles, everything. By the 1980s, the deficit was accelerating. By the 2000s, the United States was running the largest trade deficit ever recorded, more than $800 billion a year. And how was this paid for? The same way Portugal paid for its imports. The same way the Dutch and Brits did. By exporting currency, dollars instead of goods. By printing what the world needed and exchanging it for real production created elsewhere. The ability to borrow from the future, as economist Hyman Minsky called it, is often mistaken for present strength. That brings us to Stage 5, currency debasement, the desperate measure every empire takes when deficits become too large and borrowing becomes too expensive, when you can't tax enough, when you can't produce enough, when you can't stop consuming. You print. Portugal did it first. By the 1550s, facing rising deficits, the Portuguese monarchy began quietly reducing the silver content in its coins. A real that once contained a fixed weight of silver now held less. They minted more coins than they had metal to support. And like clockwork, merchants raised their prices. Inflation surged, and confidence cracked. The Dutch repeated the same mistake. Their government, drowning in war costs and colonial maintenance, inflated the guilder in the mid-1700s. The money supply expanded, the currency weakened, and Amsterdam's reputation as the financial capital of Europe eroded. By the 1780s, traders preferred the pound for large transactions. The guilder was no longer trusted. Britain's version happened in slow motion. World War I forced them off the gold standard. They returned at an unrealistic exchange rate in 1925, punishing their own economy. World War II forced them off gold again. The pound spiraled downward, devalued in 1949, again in 1967, and steadily after that. Economist John Maynard Keynes famously warned the British Parliament that a nation can stand bankruptcy better than inflation, and the pound proved the point. The United States entered Stage 5 in 2008. Quantitative easing, money creation on a scale no previous reserve currency had ever attempted. $3.5 trillion printed between 2008 and 2014. Then the pandemic hit. Another $7 trillion created in under 2 years. The money supply ballooned faster than at any time outside of major war. The result was predictable. Inflation not seen in 4 decades, eroded purchasing power, and global holders of dollars watching their reserves lose real value year after year. America's version of debasement doesn't involve shaving silver from coins. It's digital, it's faster, and because the dollar is global, the shockwaves ripple through every central bank on Earth. Inflation becomes a worldwide export, and this is where confidence, slowly at first, begins to break. And once confidence breaks, Stage 6 doesn't arrive gradually. It arrives sharply. Stage 6 is the point where the world begins quietly preparing its escape. This is the moment historians describe as the whisper phase, when governments, central banks, and global institutions stop treating the reserve currency as sacred and start looking for ways to depend on it less. It's subtle, it's slow, it's rarely announced publicly, but it always happens. And once the search for alternatives begins, the process does not reverse. Portugal hit stage 6 in the 1570s. Merchants in Asia, who had accepted Portuguese reales for decades, suddenly preferred Spanish silver or Venetian ducats. European traders began denominating contracts in other currencies. When Spain annexed Portugal in 1580, it wasn't the annexation that killed the real. The real had already been rejected by markets. Political collapse merely formalized what global commerce had already decided. The Dutch experienced their confidence fracture in the 1700s. Financial power shifted from Amsterdam to London. Major European powers reduced their guilder reserves. International contracts migrated toward the pound. By the time the Dutch realized what was happening, the transition was irreversible. Britain's unraveling happened faster than either of those. At the end of World War II, the pound was overvalued, Britain was drowning in debt, and the US was the only country with meaningful gold reserves. In 1949, when Britain devalued the pound by more than 30% overnight, every foreign holder of British currency woke up poorer. Confidence evaporated. Reserves shifted from pounds to dollars at alarming speed. Within 15 years, the pound's reign was effectively over. And now it's the dollar's turn. The early signals began in the 2010s. China and Russia started diversifying away from the dollar. Not loudly, not dramatically, but consistently. China doubled its official gold reserves. Russian reserves rotated almost entirely out of US treasuries after 2014 sanctions. This wasn't ideology, it was survival. Nations realized that holding too many dollars meant giving the United States political leverage over their financial systems. Then came the BRICS discussions. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, all large, strategically important economies, began openly talking about creating an alternative for international settlement. In 2023, they announced the framework for a BRICS currency. It hasn't launched yet, but the fact that major nations are actively working on escape options tells you how Stage 6 operates. The future arrives gradually, as British historian Arnold Toynbee wrote, and then all at once. The most symbolic break came from Saudi Arabia. For 50 years, since 1974, Saudi oil had been exclusively priced in dollars. The petrodollar system was the backbone of American monetary dominance. But in 2023, Riyadh agreed to accept Chinese yuan for part of its oil exports. That single move cracked a half-century precedent and sent a message louder than any speech. The United States no longer has unquestioned monetary authority. Central banks worldwide got the message. In the early 2000s, 72% of global reserves were held in dollars. By 2024, the number had fallen to 58%. In reserve management, a 14-point drop is not a small adjustment. It represents trillions of dollars deliberately moved out of US assets and into euros, yuan, and, most significantly, gold. Central banks are buying gold today at their highest pace since the 1970s, the last time the global monetary system fractured. Even smaller nations are hedging. Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, They're entering trade agreements that settle in local currencies instead of dollars. Regional economies are quietly building the plumbing to survive a post-dollar world. No one wants to be caught holding the bag when the dominant currency transitions to Stage 7. Stage 7 is the final step: replacement. It's not a single event. There's no award ceremony where the world declares a new reserve currency. Replacement happens through market behavior. One contract, one trade agreement, one central bank policy shift at a time. The Portuguese Real gave way to Spanish silver because Spain controlled the world's largest silver mines and produced a coin trusted everywhere, from Europe to China. The Dutch guilder ceded power to the British pound because London became the financial engine of the Industrial Revolution. The pound surrendered to the dollar because Britain was exhausted by war, and the US held the world's gold and industrial capacity. If history holds, something will eventually take the dollar's place. But that's the part people misunderstand. The question isn't just what replaces the dollar. The question is, what is even capable of replacing it? China has the manufacturing base. It has the trade surpluses, but it doesn't control global sea routes, and the yuan isn't freely convertible. Capital controls make it impossible for foreign investors to move money in and out on demand. No currency becomes a global reserve without free movement. The euro has scale, but Europe is not a unified economic organism. Demographics are collapsing, energy dependence is precarious, and there's no central fiscal authority. Germany can't carry the entire continent's structural weaknesses forever. Gold is attractive because it can't be printed or debased, and central banks know it. But there isn't enough gold to support the trillions needed for daily trade. Gold works as a store of value, not as a global transaction medium. Some analysts propose something synthetic, a basket of currencies, like IMF special drawing rights. Others imagine a commodity-backed digital currency enabled by technology. Crypto enthusiasts argue Bitcoin will replace fiat entirely, but no state willingly surrenders the power to print money, especially not the great powers. The most likely outcome? A fragmented, multipolar system. The dollar may still dominate the Americas. The euro may govern Europe. The yuan may govern Asia. Gold may settle disputes between blocs. No clean successor. No single replacement. Just a messy transition filled with volatility, fragmentation, and economic pain. And this is the part almost everyone misses. The collapse of a reserve currency isn't just a geopolitical event. It's a personal event. It reaches into the pockets of ordinary people and erases wealth that took a lifetime to accumulate. And that's exactly what we have to address next. When a reserve currency collapses, it doesn't just rewrite international trade. It reaches into homes, businesses, and bank accounts. It dissolves the lifetime savings of ordinary people who never saw it coming. And the tragedy is always the same. Citizens believe their currency is safe right up until the moment it isn't. Because to the average person, a currency collapse doesn't look like a collapse at first. It looks like rising prices. It looks like shrinking paychecks. It looks like a slow erosion disguised as normal life. When Portugal's currency broke in the late 1500s, it wasn't just the empire that suffered. Merchants who held reales watched their purchasing power disappear. Workers paid in reales saw their incomes fall behind the cost of food, clothing, and rent. Businesses that once thrived on international trade found themselves locked out because foreign merchants stopped accepting the currency altogether. The Dutch middle class experienced the same fate in the 1700s. Savings stored in guilders, savings built over decades, lost value year after year. Amsterdam, once the richest city in the world, watched its economic center of gravity shift to London. Bankers who moved early survived. Families who held on to the old currency were wiped out. And the British collapse after World War II devastated an entire generation. Anyone with pounds in a bank account, pension, or government bond suffered massive, real losses as the currency was repeatedly devalued. A British family with the equivalent of $10,000 in savings in 1945 had the purchasing power of less than half that amount 20 years later. The money didn't vanish, but what it could buy did. The American version is unfolding more slowly, but just as predictably. Since 2020, the dollar has lost roughly a quarter of its purchasing power. That means every dollar you earned, saved, or stored over the past few years now buys 25% less. And this is still early stage 6. If history holds, and history has held for 600 years, the next steps are brutal. More inflation, more erosion, more countries diversifying away, and eventually the snap moment when confidence breaks and stage 7 arrives. When a global reserve currency is replaced, it doesn't slide quietly into retirement. It collapses quickly. The British pound lost a third of its value overnight in 1949. The same could happen to the dollar. A 50% devaluation in a matter of months is not dramatic. It's historically normal. And if that happens, anyone holding dollars, dollar savings, dollar-denominated assets will see half their wealth evaporate almost instantly. So what can you do? First, accept the uncomfortable truth. Holding dollars is no longer a safe default. That doesn't mean panic. It doesn't mean abandon the currency you live with. It means recognize the risk. A reserve currency in stage 6 behaves like a melting ice cube. Still solid, still useful, but shrinking every day. So you diversify. You spread risk across currencies and across asset classes that don't depend on a single monetary system. Real estate holds value across transitions because land doesn't vanish. Productive businesses retain value because income isn't tied to a specific currency. Commodities, energy, metals, agriculture hold purchasing power through every monetary upheaval in history. These aren't exotic strategies. They're the same actions taken by the Portuguese merchants who shifted into Spanish silver, the Dutch elites who moved capital to London, the British investors who bought US assets after World War II. The people who see the cycle prepare early. The people who ignore it become the liquidity for those who didn't. Second, watch the indicators of stage 6. They are the real scoreboard. Central bank reserve data. If dollar holdings fall faster over the next few years, that confirms acceleration. Major trade agreements. If countries start settling more trade in local currencies or yuan or euros, the transition is deepening. Gold prices. When gold explodes upward, it means nations are fleeing fiat currencies entirely. And third, understand this has nothing to do with politics. It doesn't matter which party is in office or what policies are being pitched. This is math. This is structural. The forces at play are bigger than elections, presidents, or talking points. The same forces destroyed the real, the guilder, the pound, and they're destroying the dollar now. Look at the timeline. Portugal, 80 years. The Dutch, 80 years. Britain, just over 100. Every reserve currency lasts around 80 to 110 years. The dollar took reserve status in 1944. That was 81 years ago. We are sitting right at the historical average, and we are exhibiting every late-stage symptom. Massive deficits, surging debt, monetary debasement, and a global search for alternatives. But here's the truly unsettling part. The dollar is different from every previous example in one critical way. When the real collapsed, it wrecked Portugal and a handful of trading partners. When the guilder collapsed, it shattered Northern Europe. When the pound collapsed, it destabilized Britain and its empire. But when the dollar collapses, it hits everyone, every continent, every market, every central bank, every company with dollar loans, every commodity priced in dollars, oil, gold, wheat, copper. The scale is global. And because there is no ready-made successor waiting in the wings, no single currency with the military, the trade surplus, and the financial infrastructure to replace the dollar cleanly, the transition will be the most chaotic in modern history. $70 trillion of global debt denominated in USD will have to be repriced. Emerging markets will default. Corporations will collapse. Central banks will take massive losses. Supply chains will break. This isn't a doomsday fantasy. It's what happens when the foundation of the global monetary system fractures. But don't misunderstand. This isn't a prediction that America collapses tomorrow. This isn't a call to panic. It's simply the cycle. The 7-stage pattern that every reserve currency has followed. And the United States is moving from stage 5 into stage 6. The window before stage 7, the replacement, is somewhere between 10 and 20 years. Maybe shorter if confidence breaks suddenly. Maybe longer if the US slows the decline. But reversing it entirely would require something no empire has ever managed. Cutting deficits, stopping the money printing, rebuilding manufacturing, restoring productive capacity, and accepting years of political pain. Democracies don't choose hard medicine. They choose comfort, and comfort accelerates decline. So the cycle will play out. Slowly at first, then violently. And the people who understand it will position themselves so that when the snap moment comes, they're not the ones holding a currency that's evaporating. They'll be holding assets that survive any monetary system. This cycle has repeated for 6 centuries, 7 stages, 4 completed examples, and now a 5th underway. The pattern is not mysterious. It's not hidden. It's right in front of us. The only question is whether you see it in time. If this changed how you see the world, the dollar, and your financial future, then you're finally beginning to understand the pattern. It's played out 4 times. It lasts 80 to 110 years. And it's unfolding again right now. If this opened your eyes, then don't just walk away and forget it. Because stage 6 isn't a theory. It's unfolding right under us, and most people won't realize what's happening until their savings are already gone. If you want to stay ahead of the collapse instead of being crushed by it, hit subscribe. Stay here. Watch the indicators with me. Because when stage 7 hits, the people who paid attention will be the ones who survive it.